ladies and gentlemen, everyone around and in between. It is Debate Sensei, CEDA edition. We talk about topics relevant to competitive cross-examination debate. From California State University, Long Beach, we have our resident expert, Devin Cooper. Thank you very much, Devin.
Thank you.
All right. I'm Jared Kubika Miller. I don't always introduce myself, so I've been a debate coach for a very long time. All right. So in this episode, we wanted to talk about the many ways to frame a debate, and I'm really interested to hear how CEDA discusses this, because I hear how NPDA discusses it, um, and so I'm really interested in comparing the two. But let's start off. Like, what the heck does that mean to frame a debate?
So for, there's many definitions of what that could entail, but I think for me, when I think about framing debate and how I teach my students, is more so like if you are coming from a particular style of debate, what is it that you want to highlight as something that should be seen as a priority when we
Mm,
think about how we evaluate impacts and how we think about what the ballot means or the role of what the judge should do? And so in that world, we have things like a framework, a role of the ballot, and the role of the judge. And so those three things are kind of what is used to frame the debate, depending on the style that you do. So, there's people who do like critical arguments that don't
mhm,
really entail them using their bodies, right? But then there's also performance arguments that are critical, but they entail people performing some type of element of counter hegemonic thing, like using poetry or rapping or acting out something, right? And then
mhm.
there's also like the more traditional focus, which is like a policy focus that is straight up. And so that doesn't really entail any of those things, but it's more so tailored to, in a lot of cases, who does the better debating,
Mhm.
right? And like, what is it that we should prioritize as a focus of like, should we look at like, utilitarian based arguments? Should we look at debates that are policy focused, right?
Mhm.
And so that's kind of like a lot of the themes that come out of it. There is some philosophical backing for some of the traditional stuff, but it's more so very functionalist perspective of like how we understand debate. So
Well, let's do it chronologically, right? So, like, when you say traditional, I'm guessing that there was a time when a policy framework was basically all there was, right? Like, there wasn't any.
yeah, but the thing is that you wouldn't need to call it a policy framework because
Right.
that's all it was,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
So it's just like I think that this term framework and phraseology of that came about like in the probably late to 80s, early 90s when
Mhm.
some of these critical arguments started making their way into debate, like the communism slash critique of capitalism arguments
Mhm.
became one of the popular choices of the critique,
Okay.
right? So I think the introduction of the critique is something that changed the trajectory of how we think about framing a debate because
Mhm.
that was the alternative understanding that came in that was contrasted to traditional policy analysis.
Okay. So is a critical framework always a response to a policy framework, or is it a standalone thing?
I mean, it depends on who you talk to, but I think
Okay.
that it is a standalone thing. It's just that you just don't have a framework debate unless there's something that is counter to what is the status quo. And
Okay.
so the thing is that like, why would we need to say in a debate, this debate should be framed, with a traditional policy analysis if that's what everybody else is doing already? So
Mhm.
this is why we have these other understandings of how we look at framing because it is something that was used to challenge a lot of the traditional norms and procedures or analyses that existed in debate. And so I think that it's not to say that it is always in contrast to it, but by nature, it has to have some element of looking at the world differently because
Hmm.
traditional policy analysis looks at it one particular or multiple ways, but at
Yeah.
the end of the day, the end goal is to have more of a structured policy focus, plan focus analysis that talks about the outcomes of a policy or sustaining the status quo.
Okay. So let's talk about that. Let's the traditional framework. What are how do people go about it? What are the parts that make up that framework, and what are the most importantly the justifications for why it is a good way to debate?
Well, some of those particular reasons why it is utilized is to, try to bring some stasis or stasis to the debate,
Hmm.
depending on the side that you are. For affirmatives will be traditional framework if it is attached to defending their affirmative, sometimes in the form of extra contention or just as a response to a K or a performance that people read in the 1NC. And so the 2AC will establish a framework if it's not already done. And so usually there is an interpretation, of course, of what the debate space means or what your model of debate is and what that looks like. And then you would have to establish some standards or reasons why that particular framework is good. Usually that is based off of things like, policy focus or topic education,
Hmm.
predictability, limits, things of that nature. Uh, just having access to certain levels of ground, right? Because at the very basis of the policy focus framework is trying to find a fair stasis point that we have predictable arguments and a predictable landscape of things we can talk about. And so oftentimes a critical approach is not always something that is predictable,
Mm.
allegedly. And so people like to make those arguments to say that, like, if we have to predict every single alternative critical framework, that would be an unfair research burden that the
Hmm.
affirmative or the negative would have to enact. But I mean, of course, there's different interpretations or reasons why you would read framework if you're affirmative or negative. But negative, it would be more so just a procedural argument by itself that is contrasted to topicality because
Okay.
it may have elements of topicality within it, but it is its own argument to question about how you justify what you do as a model of debate and the
Okay.
actor in which you're in using.
Okay. Um, and that's all. So that's kind of the typical arguments that somebody defending a policy framework would make. Um, does it matter that much if the affirmative does the affirmative just get to kind of say, "Is like, hey, for this debate, we kind of want to use this framework." Does it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes they'll say the debate should be boiled down to a yes or no question or a resolution.
Mm,
The resolution will always be the starting point for a traditional policy analysis because they're saying that the resolution is the burden that the affirmative has, and that is the burden which we must live up to. Or if you're negative, you're saying we have the burden of rejoinder to respond to a topical affirmative, right? And so, those things are the kind of sheer traditional elements in which debate was founded upon. And so I
mhm,
think the people who were creating what standards or things, the justifications that were used in debate were basing it off of, the typical topicality understanding and how we interpret the resolution. But I think that that had to morph and change once we get these different arguments that are questioning the very function of what the topic is and how we should interpret it.
okay. Um, okay. So that is a traditional, straightforward approach to looking at a resolution. Um, is really quick. So is fiat a part of that sort of policy framework? Is that like an
Yes.
important part? Yeah.
100% it is. You got
Okay.
to be able to defend that, because if you don't have the power of fiat, you don't really have the ability to gain external benefits
So I'm interested in hearing.
or impacts of your affirmative. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm interested in hearing like what how does that worded? How is that sort of outlined in around? Have you heard?
Well, oftentimes, if I mean, it has many different wordings, but oftentimes on the affirmative, people will just have a framework that says, the affirmative should be able to weigh their aff against the status quo, or a competitive policy option, or
Hmm.
competitive option, which would be a counter plan. And the status quo is like, dis, ad, and case arguments, stuff like that. And so, and the affirmative can find different wordings based off of what their focus would be, or what they want the debate to be about. Or like
Hmm.
the debate should be a question of the policy focus, or, we should, I mean, sometimes there's frameworks that just say we shouldn't allow K's or critical arguments at all. Like,
Oh,
and
really?
right? Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, some districts are a little bit more, I don't want to say conservative, but they're a lot more traditional when it comes to their
Yeah.
analysis. Or there are certain tournaments that are
Ah,
a lot more traditional in their way of viewing things, which
really?
is
Okay.
what he was a little bit.
Okay. That's wild. Yeah, I just kind of because I remember, when I was going through debate, there was such a movement toward critical arguments that I just thought it would be it would that traditional debate wouldn't be as much of a thing today as it seems to be.
Oh no, it is.
Yeah.
It's
Oh yeah.
make debate again. Okay.
Okay. Huh.
But like the other thing too is that, like, if you're negative, you're just saying like, hey, the violation is that the affirmative is not embracing a hypothetical inaction of the resolution, right?
Right.
Or hypothetical engagement, or fiated plan, or change to the status quo. And those
All
kind of
right.
like how the things usually worded.
Okay. So that's the policy framework, using fiat, and that's how I really learned about critical debates. It was, in part, it was a criticism of fiat. Um, what would you say is at the core of critical frameworks?
Well, so that's the thing, is that I think at the core of it is more so questioning like what type of education that we are receiving, or how we're receiving it, right? I think that like a critical framework is more so trying to prioritize its form of education over a very calcified or stagnant understanding of what education could be when it
Hmm.
comes to the resolution. And so like all of these different alternative, or non-traditional forms of frameworks are all drawing from a literature base that is specific to the things that they want to talk about.
Okay.
There's not necessarily a general understanding, because all of these folks are looking at the authors that are trying to justify, or trying to further in the academy, the reasons why their field or their criticism is justified. And so this is how people will translate that into debate to justify it inside of the debate. It's just like there are limits to how we should understand certain forms of knowledge, or there's disadvantages to how certain forms of knowledge is talk about things like representations of um, hegemony, or representations of international politics, right? And
Hmm.
so those things, we want to question them and say that we should have, at the most basic level, the security K, right? A lot of people will reject security studies in a traditional
Okay.
lens, that we should have more of a critical security studies that is questioning a lot of the facets of realism, and you know um, neo-realism, which is a thing now that people like to criticize a lot, in hegemony, and all of the IR concepts that have been properly seen as dominant in the field, and
Okay.
questioning those things. So
It. So it seems to be tying into our previous episode about key authors. What
Mm.
it seems to be is when you're criticizing, it seems like you're criticizing a literature base almost. Is that a fair way to?
Well, so the traditional teams, well, I guess the critical teams do it too. They'll
Okay.
criticize a particular. So traditional teams do so more in a way that criticizes things like an epistemology focus or ontological focus first is bad, like those
Mhm.
kind of like catch-all, like bigger forms of philosophy, and they'll say
Okay.
that those particular perspectives are bad starting points, and you have more of a policy starting point. But when
Mm.
you're engaging with critical teams going against other teams that are from particular strands, they're trying to talk about how what theory of power should be focused upon. Should we look at a Marxist theory of
Okay.
power, or should we look at more of a feminist, or should we look at a racial capital lens, or should we look at a neo-colonialism or settler colonialist lens, right? And
Okay.
so those things will always have criticisms of each other in a lot of ways, to say that, even within like settler colonialists like arguments, people will say we should have more of a land focused, or some people should say we should have more of a
Okay.
sovereignty focus, right? Or more of a like theoretical methodological focus, as opposed to looking for direct land grabs. So it's all about what is in a particular field, that field has had some level of controversy over how they interpret things.
Yeah, like the more I think about critiques, it seems more like if this resolution were posed to critical theorists of settler colonialism, what would that debate sound like? Like that's it. And it's almost as if you're saying, well, that conversation is better than the IR conversation, and therefore
Mhm.
that you should like vote for my conversation, basically, vote for my.
Yeah, yeah, but in some ways, that conversation is also still a IR conversation. It's just a criticism of it and
Right.
how we should represent it. You
Okay.
know, uh, yeah, because like because some people that talk about settler, and I don't want to really, I didn't really want to touch on the subject necessarily, but when we think about the idea of settler colonialism, it is something that has an international focus to align itself with indigenous peoples outside of the United States. But if we look at, the stuff that's happening with the
Mhm.
Palestinian and Israeli conflict, right? A lot of people will say that that is a settler colonialist uh, engagement, and that the United States constantly backs a settler colonialist state, which is Israel. But that's what people say, not my
Yeah,
perspective. That is an argument
it
that
seems
will.
like people are almost fighting over that. Oh, I hope my signal is okay. It seems like people are fighting over that term, right? Because I have definitely seen the accusation thrown both ways. And I'm not saying that does not make the debate equal. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that I've seen that term, people identify and recognize that as a valuable term that they can weaponize against their opposition, and so they're kind of fighting over it. Um,
Yeah. I mean, it's
how does
really
like
about.
what does
No,
debate have to say about that? Yeah.
well, I mean, it just depends, because like a lot of people will talk about like different understandings of settler logics, and like one of the people
Right.
that I know that is very good is on this particular topic is Taylor Burrow at Wake Forest, and
Mm.
she definitely gave my students a lecture about settler colonialism a couple of years ago. And I think that a lot of different scholars who are talking about these concepts, they have disagreements, right? They're
Okay.
never really gonna like go at each other like and say that they're directly wrong, but they'll say like, "Oh, here's this person's approach, but I think here's another way to look at how that approach, manifests itself in the international arena, or in the context of debate, or the context of,
Hmm.
international relations, right?" And so I think that's just like kind of how that happens.
Mhm.
But there's not always these days a lot of heavy fighting amongst people in fields because the academy has become a lot more divisive, a lot more you can lose your job for speaking against someone's ideas, especially if
Mhm.
there's someone who's major in the academy. And so that doesn't really as happen as much. They just have like, oh, here's a different idea
Yeah.
or another approach without throwing shade at the person who created those things. So
Yeah. I what I find interesting is how instructive, how helpful these debates can be about the debates that we're seeing on things like TikTok and YouTube, you know what I mean? And because people are engaging in critical debates. Like if they are fighting over this term, they recognize the value of that term. Like that's a critical discussion. It might not be, as well grounded in research as, you want it to expect, but it's still in shape and form. It's still a critical debate. Yeah. So you said that performance is what, like a type of critical debate?
yes,
Okay.
because that is a type of critical debate that is saying that we should implicate and utilize our bodies as a tool or argument that expresses our rejection of ongoing daily violence. And it's all about the bodily performance of how we enact or perform our politics. And so I think that, like, a lot of students do this and they talk about it in debates. It's like it takes many different elements into, context. It's like people could do like rituals, people
Okay.
could pray, people could do sign language, people can rap, they could sing, they could read poetry, right? They can act out a scene from a movie or from some type of book, right? There's all types of performative elements that exist that are determined. People can do drag, right? That has been a thing that people have done before. And
Okay.
so it's just like all different types of elements, depending on how people want to express themselves and debate and to make that into an argument.
Okay. Um, Now, if one thing I always wondered about performance affirmatives was, what if they're not really that good at performing? Or is that fair game? It's kind of like, you know what
that
I'm
I
saying?
mean that
Like,
I mean that is a thing. That is a thing. That is
okay.
something that can be criticized. But you
Oh, that
know,
feels
I
bad.
feel like I feel like these days though, like a lot of people are not going to do it
Okay.
unless they are doing it correctly. On
Okay.
a college level, at least. I can't speak to the high school level because high school level, there's a bunch of different stuff going on there. But college level, you oftentimes are not going to really perform stuff necessarily unless you know what you're doing in some facet, or at
Okay.
least you're able to pull together something good for the one AC or the one NC. I can't
Okay.
really say in the past 5 years or so that I've seen a performance that was not good.
Okay.
Right. I mean, yeah, people kind of try to do things that match their strengths in debate. And
Right.
so I think that we probably have gotten away from a little bit of like performing stuff not in a not
Okay.
so good way. Now, this is not to say that people can't perform things that might be offensive, that people can make arguments about, because that's definitely a thing.
Mm,
But people just doing it like not practice and really bad is not as popular anymore, or it's
okay.
not as widespread, more so.
Um, yeah, because I mean, I've seen a lot of poetry performances, and when you have a debater doing poetry, you're kind of like I get your arguments that you're making, but I don't know. If you're looking at the two different performances side by side, I mean, there's definitely a difference in skill level that should, I don't know, be kind of
Hmm.
honored and acknowledged and identified
No,
and
it's
things
true.
like
You
that.
definitely should practice this
Yeah, yeah,
performance
absolutely. Yeah.
because you're doing something that is not of the norm, and you get to also justify its existence and use as a model in debate. So,
Hmm.
yeah.
Okay. So, are there have there been any performance affirmatives on the nuclear topic this year so far that you're aware of?
Um, so I don't think that so there's this thing. There's like people who kind of blend a lot of these things now to where
Mhm.
the entire affirmative may not be a performance. It might just be a section or different
Oh,
parts.
oh,
Like,
okay.
there's teams that will perform like some form of poetry or parts of a story throughout their speech, right? But they still refer to and read cards and things that nature. I cannot say that I've seen a full affirmative that is just performance and just refers to little evidence, right? Like, even like our team, our team of two Latinas, they do like this story that they've written about a village in a dystopian world that has been affected by nuclear weapons and nuclear
Mm,
production. And so that story is read in a very like passionate way with different like inflections and tones and parts of the story to build suspense and things like that. But like that's not the entire act. Like it's just like sections of the affirmative, and we draw upon criticizing the resolution in particular ways and the knowledge from it. So it's like even in these performance affirmatives, there is an embedded criticism, or at least there should be, of the topic or of practices that people are doing when we talk about nuclear weapons.
when people are okay, here's one thing about framework is if like the affirmative is going to take the sort of privilege of framing a debate in a certain way. Do they also have the responsibility to kind of outline what the whole debate looks like, including what role their opposition should play, or is it just like
That's usually a thing that will occur.
okay,
Yes. Particularly, that's arguments that are made by people who are negative.
oh,
Like they'll
okay,
say, hey, you have started this debate in a particular way, but what is the role of the negative in this conversation?
okay,
Right. And in some ways, you'll see that there could be a team, like a K team going against another K team, and that affirmative K team is criticizing the structures of debate and calling it like, these structures are masculine or white
hmm,
supremacist or classist, racial cap. And then the negative team will say, well, what's the role of the negative? It's just like, we're not the team that you're criticizing. We're
hmm,
not the team that is making debate XYZ. So why are you reading this app against us? And it's just
right,
like, I kind of feel like I'm a little biased in that discussion because I'm like, I get to read my app wherever. You got to find out something to say on a negative. It's not like, oh, it's another K team. Oh, shoot, let me change my app. No, I'm still
yeah,
going to read criticism, whatever. But some people will say on a negative is that like, hey, we're not the team that you're talking about. Why do we have to negate this? Why do we have to negate your
right,
understanding of resolution if we have similar bases of doing that?
yeah,
So
and it comes full circle, like the role of. So what is the role of debate? Like, why do we do this? I guess, like, isn't that what framework is really questioning?
I mean, framework is questioning which model of debate is good for everyone to engage or utilize. And
Yeah.
so oftentimes there will be people who are arguing that we should look at it as a model or we should look at it as this individual round.
Mm,
Oftentimes it's the affirmative that is saying we should look at it from the individual round if it's a critical act. Because it's like I feel like in some cases it's a really unfair burden to make it so that the affirmative always has to defend a model of debate and what
mm,
debate should look like writ large. But that's
mhm,
kind of what negative teams are forcing them to say is like, what is your model of debate and how does that allow certain people to fit within it? And
mhm.
that's kind of like it's kind of a bit of a burden to do, but you also are changing a bit of the normal way of how you're supposed to advocate for affirmative under resolution. So it's kind of catch 22 in a way.
All right. Well, I do feel like I learned a lot more about framework, and I felt like I already knew quite a bit. So it was a pleasure talking to you about all this. All right. All right. I look forward to talking about other stuff in the future. This is Debate Sensei CEDA edition with Devin Cooper from Long Beach. Thank you very much, Devin.
Thank you.
All right.